and this is just to bring it to the third story for me, which is the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of what you were saying, Tej, about the ways that, I mean, we've talked about this, and if you are for the first time hearing about the Reconstruction or why we need a new Reconstruction, watch the Newsbroke video about it, and also like listen to Reverend William Barber, who has great speeches and a book on the Third Reconstruction. Yeah. But the idea that,
but mostly watch our comedy show.
Watch our comedy show. We have a soundbite from him.
Yeah.
But the idea that any real rebuilding of this country always and needed to have put Black Americans in that rubric and not leave them aside. And that if we're moving forward on economic justice, that is part and parcel a fight for racial justice. They go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. They are integral to one another. And we saw that in this moment of desperation of this country, everyone's on lockdown, that the police and the machinery of the state found it in their fucked up little hearts to not only kill someone like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, but repress the shit out of anyone who came out to the streets who dared to protest how unjust that was. And here we're all scrambling for money. The state has no money. Oh, no, here's the fucking money. And I think that crystallized so much for young Americans, obviously Black Americans, but everybody. And what's been so hard about that is the ways that then the Democratic Party has tried to, contain that movement and also blame that movement by saying it was the defund the police, slogan that cost, seats in the House, that's why it was so close with Trump, that they played into Trump's rhetoric. They kicked up a lot of fucking rhetoric about the BLM movement, right? Completely demonizing it. So, yeah. And so it just feels like this was also the year where we were just like, enough. When will we have the generation that doesn't have to fight for civil rights for all Americans? When do we get there? Because every time it feels like a breaking point. 94, after the Rodney King beating and riot, now it's going to change. It doesn't. Then that goes back and back and back. And I started talking about Kwanzaa and the Watts riot, 65, And now I think the question is, looking forward to 2021, there's no real question. I'm just talking here, you guys, is will we work toward having a generation that doesn't have to fight for their rights to actually live normally and not be policed and not be gunned down in the streets, And
it almost feels like that's entirely up to the Biden administration.
Exactly.
I mean, it feels like the leadership that he has yet to show. I'll give him a chance because he's not even in office yet. In terms of hearing people's demands, at the very least, engaging with them in a constructive way.
Yeah.
So far, not impressed, and I think it is entirely within his power and the power of his administration to try to create a generation of people who don't have to continually fight for civil rights. And we're going to hear another 4 years, I think, of the Republicans didn't do this and that, and that's not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it. It's not going to convince
or
anyone.
To spend 4 years calming the fears of Republicans when it comes to this very righteous movement.
Yeah.
Biden said that he wants to be FDR. We shall fucking see. It doesn't look likely.
Yeah. So far, he hasn't done anything to be FDR. Maybe he just meant no, I want to die in office. Is that it? That's what I meant.
I'm a transitional president.
I want to enter a war and die in office. I'm FDR. God.
But maybe he can be Johnson, right? Like Johnson, who I just read this today, but this is a president who used the N-word a lot.
Yeah.
And yet he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he actually called it the N-word bill.
Jeez.
I'm not even joking, but this was he's a piece of shit. But this was a seminal piece of legislation that took the work of a lot of grassroots organizers. I mean, and actual, people in the streets fighting like hell for it.
Yeah.
So, don't give up on a racist, I guess.
And to me, that proves an important point, which is that, your political leaders are tools. And I don't mean that derogatorily. Well, I do. But also, this is why anytime anyone shits on organizers or, calls them like, oh, they're the organizer class or anything like that, I look at it and I go, no, these are people who are just understand that what politicians are. They understand that they are tools and that they can be utilized. And you may not like the politician because you're like, oh, they, stand against everything that I, you may have whatever kind of purity test you have on certain politicians. And there's plenty of reasons to hate Nancy Pelosi, but she is a tool and she can be utilized. I mean, if LBJ can be utilized to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act,
right,
then Nancy Pelosi probably could be used. She just has to be pressured or, kicked out of office. Kneeling
in her Manolos.
Yeah.
But Tej, I'm interested in how do you see from a historical perspective this civil rights movement now versus, in the 50s and 60s and in some ways it's all the more dire. And I mean, it was dire then, but it felt like at a time when America was sort of ascending, as you were talking about, industrializing, ascending, and leaving out the voting rights of Black Americans. And yet now we're on this awful screeching decline, and we still find it in our, in the fiber of this country to oppress Black Americans.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, the framing of sort of the third Reconstruction, I think, is really valuable. And I think from a sort of positive perspective, I think it's really important that we see sort of racial and economic justice as intersecting, not as a coalition, but as, two things that really can't be broken apart, So, I mean, in the first Reconstruction after the Civil War, the first schools for white Southerners, the first universal schools were in the Reconstruction governments with Black leadership to even create public schools for white Southerners, and sort of to understand that narrative. And the CIO unions that were the backbone of sort of the New Deal leftward openings were interracial at their founding, not necessarily for just purely ethical reasons, though there was that too, but also just because of their model of industrial unionism, which was, sort of a class-wide union, which justified a sort of power in injury to one, injury to all ethic. Yeah. So the CIO unions were interracial. So I think, the civil rights movement, the Black freedom movement, I think a couple of key things is the way that it sort of was a whirlwind that emerged out of livelihood struggles. I write about World War II and the mass service of African Americans in the armed forces during World War II as this time where everyday livelihood, being a worker in the military or in defense industries, was the basis that grievances were spoken out by service members, men and women, and also the way that sort of echoed into a whirlwind to create a movement, and I think the way that that's coming up now, people have highlighted, Breonna Taylor was an essential worker, she was an emergency medical worker, and to really sort of foreground those kinds of intersections that don't sort of bracket racial and economic issues from each other, and issues that are specific, so-called specific grievances of Black people or Black and Latino and Native people from sort of majoritarian economics, right? Not pitting the two against each other, but seeing sort of, when all Black lives matter, all Black lives matter vision. Philando Castile was an essential worker in the public sector, so that kind of narrative. And I think telling that story is really important. And it's absolutely true that the level of popular sympathy for some of the more radical ideas of the Black Lives Movement now is greater than it was among white and non-Black populations in the 1960s. And, historians still debate the backlash to the civil rights movement. Did that help Nixon win in 1968? And people have different takes on that. But the narrative now is very different because there was far more sympathy. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was not popular among white people in the last years of his life at all, in the way that Black Lives has this broad multiracial sympathy now. So that's a real opening for these movements, for Green New Deal, Black Lives, these kinds of movements, to sort of have a vision for universal policies, but also with sort of a racial justice center of gravity. So there's real openings.
Yeah, I mean, that was so interesting looking at like Nixon and his election and the way that he played on the exact same shit. I mean, you could compare the ads run in in his campaign and the ads that Trump ran this year and see that the exact same thing. Trump blaming the unrest on Democrats. Motherfucker, it's on you. It is on you.
You are in office.
And exactly. And my problem with all of that is that there's never been a strong counter narrative. Just like I think, it's funny because Tej and I, I think came up during the anti-war movement when it was like no one was putting out a counter narrative to the extreme Islamophobia against Muslims. And in the United States, in the world, it's instead we've sort of let it dissipate, and now it's like kind of gauche and like, oh, it's not cool anymore, and like maybe I don't like 24 anymore, and like maybe we realize white men are actually more likely terrorists than Muslims are. But like there was never a strong counter narrative then, as in that issue as in this issue, to be like, actually, this is righteous anger. Actually, this is not about unrest in the street. Like there was, the fact that, what is her name? Her name is Kimberly, but I can't remember her last name. I think the woman in Kenosha who has this like incredible viral video explaining looting, explaining, why there is this anger in the streets. Like the fact that we rely on, a protester to give us the narrative, and yet the party, the Democratic Party, isn't offering like a strong narrative countering all of that BS coming out from the right. And the question is like, can you ever counter racism effectively? I think you can. Anyway, so it's like how do we keep falling back to these tropes, and how are we so susceptible? How is the narrative just still so susceptible to white people and playing on white people's fear? Anywho, this is
as the only white person on this podcast, I can answer that. I need to be coddled. Coddle me. Help me understand.
I'm coddling Matt right now.
Don't speak passionately about any subject. Speak monotonally, and I will continue to do nothing.
Have the voice of Ira Glass always.
Yeah, please talk in your best Ira Glass or Terry Gross, whatever your flavor of mayonnaise. And I'll be sure to, listen intently and continue to uphold the status quo.
This might be kind of too in-depth, but one last question for you, Tej, which is, do you see this connection between a resurgence of like real white nationalism, far right, extremism, and like the fact that America's role in the world is shifting because of our like overzealous military ventures that have cost us trillions of dollars, and the fact that we're not number one? Like, is there a connection where we're just sort of seeing that like fascism, like, what's the connection between US global militarism kind of fading and this like rise of far right extremism?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think, there's a couple of things. One is, like I said, when you say how was there sort of New Deal prosperity in the 40s and 50s, and the idea that there was some sort of top-down acceptance, right, of higher wages and some welfare state, because there was super profits, from sort of consumer society and building the suburbs and other kinds of things. Working class people move to the suburbs and they buy consumer products. And so there was that narrative. So there is this, and this is, you can have an economist on to explain the precise economics, but there's a perception that there was economic growth in the 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s that created profits and created growth. And sort of with the turn towards neoliberalism, with declining profits, the rich want to just hoard their money, in their own private ways. And in the popular imagination, it's this idea that we can't just keep growing the economy and then having some redistribution. So that certainly gives a place for nationalism and racism and other kinds of sectoral sort of sorting, and then the idea that those who are worthy need to get whatever they get, whether they're middle class or working class.
So it's basically part of the game of pitting working people against each other.
Absolutely.
It's all in service of hoarding more and being like, no, trickle down economics. No redistribution, no corporate tax rate. Don't raise the corporate tax rate, right? Just keep it as is. In fact, lower it. I mean, it's tale as old as time, I think, but
and with we'll see it with also climate change, right? If there's all this narrative of when right-wing parties sort of acknowledge climate change, how will they then use eco-fascism and other kinds of ways of protecting those who are worthy and those who are on their side. But it was contested then, and it was debated then, and it's contested now, and it can be debated now.
Hey, you made it to the end of the clip. That's probably because you like left politics and comedy, and me is gonna deliver. I mean, I am going to deliver more of that. So why don't you subscribe to this channel right now, and you'll never miss another show again. Ever again.